This is a pretty unique situation among video games, in that it's sort of a pseudo-sequel with a completely different style of gameplay. It expands the world of a previous title while trying to offer something new. This time around, Dynasty Warriors mashes with Fire Emblem for the second time, but instead of being a crossover, it's solely focused on one title, like Age of Calamity before it. And when I first saw the announcement trailer, I was pretty skeptical. I wasn't hyped up for it, but I was invested enough into Three Houses to want to try this one out. Now, I don't dislike Three Houses. I wouldn't have made all these videos if I did, but it being another Warriors game did come with some asterisks in my head. What made Age of Calamity work so well in tandem with Breath of the Wild was that a Warriors game fits the wartime narrative before Ganon strikes, and a quieter open-world adventure suited a post-apocalyptic setting. Both Three Houses and Three Hopes are set in a continental war, so I was curious as to how the Warrior-styled gameplay would service the world of Fodlan. Now, if we go into Dynasty Warriors gameplay, first I want to talk about my biggest issue with it. If we look at these two clips, which one seems more exciting to you? Now, if you've never played or heard of either of these titles, you'd think the second one, right? You wouldn't be wrong, only in my opinion, the second one gets old really quick. The monotony of effortlessly clearing away such enormous waves of soldiers just kind of makes the act of doing it in the first place insignificant. It's why I prefer adventure games like Zelda, where enemies are treated more like points of interest rather than war-type games where they're the grass you have to mow down. Most of these titles are about map control with gameplay that doesn't evolve after the first few hours. To be fair, some of them do try to differentiate themselves by adding extra quirks, like how Age of Calamity brings back the slow-motion flurry attacks from Breath of the Wild, and this one with issuing commands across the battlefield. Even on the hardest difficulty, it doesn't feel too engaging when all you're doing is repeatedly spamming the same buttons for that shiny S. Going over on the out-of-combat stuff first, I do like that the option to spend gold to artificially increase unit levels returns from Fire Emblem Warriors. Going forward with future mainline Fire Emblem titles, I do hope this feature stays since it cuts down most of the time spent grinding. The simplification of the weapon equipment and class upgrades is good for relieving any time otherwise spent managing them, but it does come at a cost of more restrictive builds. You're given more and less at the same time in that regard. Upgrading facilities is kind of a chore, even though relatively speaking, it's a lot less work than what you'd find in other games with similar functions. Managing support levels and unlocking conversations definitely took up the bulk of my time in camp, but it is satisfying to max them out. In combat, there's not much to actually complain about. Despite me earlier saying that I wasn't a fan of this kind of gameplay, I don't really hate most of it, it's just not very exciting. Switching around which characters to deploy via the energized units and experimenting each person's unique quirk with different classes does keep things fresh for the first playthrough, although the lack of variety in mission types and maps do wear you out as time goes on. Thankfully, you are given an option to skip the non-important maps via the Vanguard whistle once you start a new Game Plus. In my opinion, the most fun classes are Brawlers, Lance Cavaliers, and Sword Fighters. Mages and healers feel the most unsatisfying, which made me change the classes for most of the default spellcasters in all of my playthroughs. The Merc Whistle was definitely one of my favorite features, and using it to combine other characters' unique actions with Shez's moveset made the several playthroughs at least somewhat bearable. But hey, if you don't like the gameplay, at least there's the story, right? Well, personally, I don't think Fire Emblem as a whole is known for their stories. Their bread and butter is their tactical RPG board game War Battles, but you could argue that their strongest aspects are their characters, and that is still thankfully present here. But good characters don't always equal a good story, unfortunately. I have a hard time calling something good when stories of this quality are so prevalent in modern media, whether it's a movie, TV show, or a video game. Even when a story is perfectly competent with no glaring flaws, it usually doesn't amaze me enough to make me think that it's good. It just feels average at this point. Take Three Houses, for example. I personally don't think any of the routes tell an above average story. The closest thing you get to a good story is this one. You have a central character arc with clear themes and resolutions that form and end nicely. This one just had too many loose ends that were left unanswered. This one would have been good if it didn't try to cram 50 important plot points toward the end, and then this one is just the worst version of this one. If you consider these routes as pieces of a larger whole after you finish each one, it paints a better picture, yes, but getting to that point after replaying the game that many times can ruin the pacing. And this is a game where replay value is supposed to be high. That being said, however, I do appreciate that the story in Three Houses is actually trying to say something substantial. It delves deeper into the realities of war. It starts to show you ideas like there being no right or wrong side, winning isn't always a good thing, and others along those lines. It didn't feel like there was a golden route where everything is sunshine and rainbows and the rest of the routes are wrong like this stupid ass game had. If we compare the story of Three Houses to the rest of the more modern Fire Emblem titles, it's probably the best one among them, so the franchise does look promising going forward. So when the time came to play Three Hopes, I wasn't ready to set my expectations too high, because if Three Houses was any indication, the same quality of stories would also be here. But to my surprise, they got a lot of things right this time around. Right off the bat, they speedrun the monastery section. This is good for existing fans to not have to slog through yet another few months of the school year, and it throws newer fans right into the heat of the action. Shez is a much more interesting and engaging protagonist than Byleth, and it shows during their several supports. They definitely made the right decision to include newer relationships between certain students that just did not exist in Three Houses. Going back to what I said about characterization, it has improved substantially. Within the context of Three Houses, a lot of my enjoyment came from the outstanding performances of the voice cast, and it feels like they haven't missed a beat here. Even with Alois, the guy whose sole purpose in Three Houses was to tell bad jokes, his jokes got better in this game. Also all the dads. It was nice seeing the students interact with their dads. It seems like some of the ideas Three Houses talked about are better represented in Three Hopes. Now it seems like there are more consequences for picking one house over another without making any playable faction seem like the ultimate good or evil. When we talk about the actual story, however, here's where things start to crumble. The thing that jumps out to most people is that it's not actually a story because there's no conclusion. There's both good and bad with this approach. You leave the ending up to interpretation, and it feels more of its own thing, but you sacrifice pacing and momentum in exchange. What disappointed me the most was we learned basically nothing new about the world of Fodlan. We see new bits and pieces of information that are interesting but are gone in a flash and never explored again. The inclusion of the dimension Zarus for only a single chapter is an example of this. This feels like an incredible missed opportunity where we could have had a more substantial what-if scenario that saw either the world or characters in a completely new light. You could argue that Claude is pretty different here than he is in Three Houses, but he backpedals back to his old self pretty quickly whenever it seemed like he was going to venture in a new direction. If we do the same thing we did with Three Houses, and look at all the routes here as objectively as possible, I don't think I really like any of them. There may be no golden route, but none of them were truly satisfactory. For Scarlet Blaze, I wanted to see more of the Empire's relationship with and or against the Agarthans, since that was a major complaint most fans had when it came to Crimson Flower, but most of the conflict here is still against the other two nations in the Church. Azure Gleam had an interesting idea where the Agarthans retake control of the Empire, but that didn't really go anywhere narratively. Golden Wildfire was this absolute clusterfuck where nothing really made any sense. From what I've seen, a lot of people had issues with Golden Wildfire the most, but I thought it was pretty entertaining with how unpredictable it was. The main problem with it, at least from my perspective, is that it's too unfocused and tries to do a ton of things at once without really nailing anything down. Overall, it's a pretty mixed bag. A lot of things went wonderfully right, and a lot of other things went horribly wrong. I will give Intelligent Systems props for experimenting with newer concepts and trying something wild, but honestly I had hoped they tried to make something even more wild. The setting and plot have elements that feel both familiar and new, though overall it feels almost too familiar. Three Hopes, as a result, doesn't have too much of its own identity within the overall Fire Emblem lore. If they want to make another Fire Emblem Warriors title, there's a lot that they have to look at and fine-tune in order to make something great. It's a fun game, but it loses that spark pretty early on into the experience. But enough about what I think. What do you guys think? Within my own videos, I've seen a lot of discussions and comments emerge with conflicting viewpoints, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and opinions, whether you agree or disagree with me. With that said, thanks for watching.